You're standing in a grocery store. There are entire aisles dedicated to beer. IPAs, stouts, lagers, wheat beers, sours, things with names you cannot pronounce, brewed by people with beards you cannot explain. You grab one, pay for it, crack it open at home, and forget about it before the can is empty. You don't think about it, nobody does. But here's the thing, that drink in your hand is one of the oldest manufactured products in the history of the human species. Older than bread, older than the wheel, older than writing, older than money, older than cities. Beer is so old that your body was preparing to drink it millions of years before you existed. Millions before your species had a name, before your species had a face. Your ancestors were already being pulled toward the thing that would eventually become the drink sitting on your coffee table right now. So how did humans discover beer? And why, of all the things we could have figured out first, was it this? The answer starts not with humans, not with civilization, not even with anything you'd recognize as a person. It starts roughly 10 million years ago in a forest canopy in Africa with a small primate eating fruit off the ground, and one accidental chemical reaction that would quietly rearrange the trajectory of the entire human story. Let's start with the part nobody thinks about. Your body is designed to process alcohol. Not in a poetic sense, in a literal enzymatic molecular sense. You carry a specific enzyme called alcohol dehydrogenase 4, or ADH4, that breaks down ethanol with a level of efficiency that most animals on Earth simply do not have. Most mammals encounter ethanol in their liver basically files a formal complaint. The whole experience is somewhere between deeply unpleasant and medically dangerous, but primates, specifically our branch of the primate family tree, handle it differently. And here's the part that should stop you. That enzyme didn't appear when humans started brewing. It didn't appear when agriculture began. It appeared roughly 10 million years ago, before Homo sapiens, before Homo erectus, before anything you'd call human was walking around anywhere. A geneticist named Matthew Kerrigan at Santa Fe College, along with a team that included researchers from multiple institutions, published a study in 2015 tracing the ADH4 mutation back to the common ancestor of humans, chimpanzees, and gorillas. The mutation made that enzyme 40 times more efficient at metabolizing ethanol than the version carried by earlier primates. Now pause. Why beer matters here is this. That mutation didn't happen because our ancestors were sitting around brewing anything. It happened because they were eating fruit off the ground. When fruit falls from a tree and sits on the forest floor, natural yeasts land on the surface, consume the sugars, and produce ethanol as a byproduct. The fruit ferments. And the riper the fruit, the more ethanol it contains and the more calories it delivers. A biologist at UC Berkeley named Robert Dudley spent over 2 decades building a theory around this. He calls it the Drunken Monkey Hypothesis. The idea is straightforward. Primates that were attracted to the smell of ethanol, that faint boozy sweetness in overripe fruit, found more calories. They ate better. They survived longer. They had more offspring. Over millions of years, natural selection essentially wired a preference for fermented flavor into the primate brain. This isn't guesswork. In 2022, researchers led by primatologist Christina Campbell at California State University Northridge went to Panama and studied wild black-handed spider monkeys. They collected fruit the monkeys chose to eat and tested it for alcohol content. The fruit these monkeys actively preferred contained between 1% and 2% ethanol by volume. Then they collected urine from the same free-ranging monkeys and found ethyl glucuronide and ethyl sulfate, metabolic byproducts that prove the animals weren't just swallowing the alcohol, they were processing it. Their bodies were doing real metabolic work on that ethanol. These monkeys were, in a very technical and measurable sense, getting drunk in the trees, not on purpose, not recreationally, just by eating lunch. So before a single human being ever intentionally fermented a single grain of barley, the biological architecture for enjoying alcohol was already millions of years old. Your taste for beer was inherited from a small fruit-eating ancestor who had absolutely no idea what beer was. And that right there is why you reach for a cold one on a Friday night without ever thinking about why it feels good. It's because feeling good about fermented things has been keeping your lineage alive for 10 million years. Alright, so primates have been accidentally consuming fermented fruit for millions of years. Our bodies evolved to enjoy it and process it efficiently. But at some point, something fundamentally different happened. At some point, a human, an actual thinking, planning, cognitively modern human, looked at grain that had gotten wet and bubbly and decided not just to taste it, but to make it happen again. On purpose, that is a completely different kind of moment, because accidental consumption is biology. Intentional production is technology. And the gap between those two things is enormous. It requires observation, it requires memory, it requires the ability to think, this happened to that grain last time it sat in water. What if I do it again? That is not instinct. That is science without the lab coat. So when did that happen? In 2018, a team led by Stanford archaeologist Li Lu published a paper in the Journal of Archaeological Science that quietly rewrote part of the human timeline. They had been working at Rockefet Cave, a burial site near modern-day Haifa in Israel, used by a group called the Natufians. The Natufians were a culture of semi-nomadic hunter-gatherers who lived in the eastern Mediterranean between roughly 15,000 and 11,500 years ago. They buried their dead with flowers, they kept dogs, they carved decorations into bone tools. These were not simple people by any reasonable definition. Inside the cave, embedded in the bedrock, Lu's team found stone mortars. Ancient carved bowls still containing residue after 13,000 years. When they analyzed that residue using starch grain analysis and phytolith examination, the results were unambiguous. The Natufians had been making beer. Specifically, they had been processing wheat and barley through a multi-step operation. First, germinating the grain in water, a process we now call malting, which converts the starches into fermentable sugars, then mashing and heating the grain, then leaving the mixture to ferment with wild airborne yeast. Now stop. Read that process again. Malting, mashing, fermenting. That is not someone accidentally leaving wet grain in a bowl. That is a three-stage brewing protocol. And it was happening 13,000 years ago. And here's the fact that should genuinely rearrange how you think about civilization. The Natufians were not farmers. They did not plant crops. They did not have fields. They were gathering wild grain from the landscape around them and using some of it not to eat, but to brew. Beer production predates agriculture. Let that sit for a moment, because up until fairly recently, the standard story went like this. Humans settled down. They invented farming. They grew surplus grain, and eventually somebody figured out that wet grain turns into something drinkable. Beer came after bread. Beer came after civilization. Beer was a consequence of settled life. The Natufian discovery says the opposite. These people were making beer while they were still moving with the seasons. They were brewing before they were farming. And the context tells you something even more interesting. They were doing it in a burial cave, among their dead. Beer, from the very first moment we can identify it in the archaeological record, was not casual. It was sacred, which brings us to the most controversial question in the entire history of food production. Did humans invent agriculture because they wanted bread, or because they wanted beer? This idea has a name. It's called the beer before bread hypothesis. The version most people encounter was championed by archaeologist Brian Hayden of Simon Fraser University, who argued in the 1990s that competitive feasting, including the desire to produce fermented drinks for large social gatherings, was a primary driver of early food production. But the idea actually goes back further. In 1953, a botanist named Jonathan Sauer suggested in a paper in the journal Economic Botany that the initial cultivation of grain crops could have been motivated by the desire to brew beer rather than bake bread. Think about this. From the perspective of a hunter-gatherer. You've been doing fine for hundreds of thousands of years. Your ancestors did fine. Their ancestors did fine. You move with the seasons, you hunt, you gather, you eat. Life is not easy, but it works. Now, someone comes along and says, hey, what if instead of all that, you stayed in one place, broke up the ground with a stick, planted seeds, waited several months, hoped nothing ate your crop, and then ground the result into flour? That is an objectively terrible pitch. The return on investment is months away and completely uncertain. But what if we could make beer whenever we wanted? That is a pitch people understand. The Natufians understood it 13,000 years ago. Now, I want to be honest here because this debate is far from settled. Many archaeologists, including Dorian Fuller at University College London, argue that bread and porridge came first, and that beer was a byproduct of grain processing already developed for food. The nutritional argument is strong. Grain provides reliable calories, and bread doesn't require you to wait for fermentation. The mainstream view in archaeology still favors food production as the primary driver. But the timeline keeps pushing against that mainstream view. Every new discovery of early brewing seems to predate or sit alongside the earliest evidence of farming. And at some point, you have to ask whether the conventional narrative has it backwards. Let's move forward, because after the Natufians, the archaeological evidence starts stacking up from multiple locations simultaneously, and that pattern itself tells you something extraordinary. Jump roughly 4,000 years forward to about 7,000 BCE. A small Neolithic village called Jiahu in China's Henan province along the Yellow River. Molecular archaeologist Patrick McGovern at the University of Pennsylvania, probably the single most important figure in the study of ancient alcohol, analyzed residue inside pottery jars excavated from the site. What he found was a mixed fermented beverage: rice, honey, hawthorn fruit, and possibly grape, about 9,000 years old. And at a site called Kiaotu in Zhejiang province, dating to roughly 9,000 years ago, a team published findings in 2021 showing that long-necked pottery vessels found alongside human burials contained residue from a fermented beer made of rice, Job's tears, and tubers. The beer was made using what appears to be a mold-based saccharification starter, the earliest known example of that technique. These pots were placed with the dead. 9,000 years ago, beer and burial together again. But here's the part relevant to beer's global reach. At another Chinese site called Mijaya, dating to around 3400 BCE, researchers including Li Liu found brewing equipment, wide-mouth pots, funnels, and narrow-necked amphorae, along with residue that showed a beer recipe using broomcorn millet, barley, a grain called Job's tears, and tubers. The barley at Mijaya predates any other evidence of barley in China by about 1,000 years, suggesting it was imported specifically for brewing before it ever became a food crop. Think about that. A grain traveled thousands of miles across ancient trade routes, not because people wanted to eat it, but because people wanted to drink it. The recipe also included mold-based fermentation starters, a technique called kwai in Chinese, where specific fungi are used to break down complex starches in grain before fermentation begins. This is the direct ancestor of the process used to make sake, baijiu, and Korean makgeolli today. A continuous fermentation tradition stretching from a 5,000-year-old pottery vessel to a glass of sake on a table somewhere in Osaka tonight. And now think about the geography for a second. Israel, China. These cultures were not in contact. They were not sharing recipes over the internet. They were not trading fermentation tips at international conferences. They each figured out beer independently, completely independently, and they did it within a relatively narrow window of human prehistory, which means beer is not a one-time accident that spread. It is something that humans, when given grain and water and enough time and curiosity, will invent on their own, every single time. We are, as a species, hardwired to discover beer. The ingredients practically beg us to combine them. And this is the point where you might be thinking, okay, but how does accidental fermentation actually work? What is the actual science of turning grain into beer? Good question. Because the answer is both absurdly simple and quietly miraculous. Grain contains starch. Starch is a complex sugar that yeast cannot eat directly. But when grain gets wet and begins to sprout, it produces enzymes, specifically amylase, that break those complex starches down into simple sugars. Maltose, glucose. These are the sugars that yeast can consume. And yeast is everywhere. It's on the surface of grain. It's floating in the air. It's on your skin right now. A single-celled fungus called Saccharomyces cerevisiae, the same organism responsible for bread rising, has been living alongside humans for the entire span of our existence. When that yeast lands in a warm, sugary liquid, it starts eating the sugar and producing two byproducts: carbon dioxide, which makes the liquid fizzy, and ethanol, which makes you happy. That's it. That's beer. Wet grain, a little warmth, and time. The process is so simple that it almost certainly happened by accident hundreds of thousands of times before anyone thought to do it on purpose. Imagine a Natufian gatherer storing wild barley in a stone mortar. It rains. The grain gets wet. A few days later, the water is bubbly and smells strange. Somebody tastes it, and for reasons that defy every sensible survival instinct, they decide they like it. Now, if you're still with me, and I sincerely hope you are, because we're about to get into the part where beer basically builds civilization. Let's talk about Mesopotamia. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, modern-day Iraq, the Sumerians, the people who invented writing, who invented the wheel, who built the first cities, and who, not coincidentally at all, ran their entire economy partly on beer. Archaeological evidence from Göbekli Tepe in the Zagros Mountains of western Iran, studied by Virginia Badler and colleagues in the 1990s, places beer production in the greater Mesopotamian region as early as 3500 BCE. They found calcium oxalate residue, a crystalline byproduct of barley beer fermentation, preserved inside clay vessels. But Mesopotamia didn't just brew. Mesopotamia turned brewing into an institution. Sumerian workers received daily rations of beer as a core part of their wages. This was not generosity, this was payroll. If you were a laborer building a temple, a scribe copying clay tablets, a farmer maintaining irrigation channels, you received beer. Administrative tablets survived, thousands of them, recording these distributions with the obsessive precision of a modern accounting department. Average workers received about 2 liters per day. Senior officials received more. The dead were buried with beer for the afterlife, because apparently the Sumerians saw no reason why dying should interrupt a reasonable daily ration. Beer was currency, beer was salary, beer was religion, beer was medicine, beer was the foundation of social order. And here's where the story gets genuinely beautiful. The Sumerians loved beer so deeply that they created an entire goddess dedicated to it. Her name was Ninkasi. It translates, and I am not making this up, as the lady who fills the mouth. She was the daughter of Enki, the god of water and wisdom, and her entire divine portfolio was brewing. Around 1800 BCE, an anonymous Sumerian poet composed a hymn in her honor. The hymn to Ninkasi, preserved on 2 clay tablets, it is simultaneously a religious poem, a love letter to a goddess, and, depending on which scholars you ask, a working beer recipe encoded in verse. It describes malting grain on the ground, baking it into a bread called bapir, soaking the bapir in water, filtering the liquid through a woven reed mat, and leaving the result to ferment in a collecting vessel. In 1989, Fritz Maytag, founder of Anchor Brewing Company in San Francisco, along with Sumerian scholar Miguel Civil, actually reconstructed the recipe. They brewed Ninkasi beer using the hymn as instructions. The result was about 3.5% alcohol, cloudy, slightly sour, and reportedly tasted like something between cider and champagne with a date-like sweetness. They served it at the annual meeting of the American Association of Microbrewers. People drank it from clay cups through long reed straws, exactly as the Sumerians had 3,800 years earlier. 3,800 years, and the recipe still worked. That is either a testament to the precision of ancient Sumerian knowledge or to the sheer stubbornness of yeast. Probably both. Now, the Babylonians, who inherited an expanded Sumerian culture, took the entire operation further. They documented at least 20 distinct varieties of beer, light and dark, filtered and unfiltered, honey-sweetened, spiced, fresh, and aged. They had an entire classification system for fermented grain beverages at a time when most of the planet was still figuring out pottery. And then, this is the detail that honestly makes me laugh every time I read it. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest surviving written law codes in human history, dating to approximately 1754 BCE, includes specific legislation about beer, about minimum quality standards for tavern keepers, about the proper pricing of different grades, about what happens to a tavern owner caught watering down the product. The punishment for diluting beer in ancient Babylon was death by drowning. You would be thrown into the river. The first written legal code in human history included consumer protection law for beer quality. We have always known what matters, and by the way, Babylonian taverns were typically run by women. Female brewers and tavern keepers are documented extensively in Mesopotamian records. Brewing was, for most of early human history, women's work. The idea that beer is a male domain is extremely modern and historically illiterate. For thousands of years, the people who made beer were women. The goddess of beer was a woman. The first named author in human history, a poet named Enheduanna, who composed hymns in Sumer around 2300 BCE, was a woman. Beer and women have been intertwined since the very beginning. Let's keep going, because Egypt takes the beer story in an entirely different direction. If Mesopotamia turned beer into an institution, Egypt turned it into infrastructure. The workers who built the pyramids at Giza, and I need to be clear here, decades of Egyptological research has established that these were paid laborers, not slaves, received beer as a daily ration. About 4 to 5 liters per day per worker. That was their salary, not coins, not grain. Beer, Egyptian beer, made primarily from emmer wheat and barley, was thick, nutritious, low in alcohol by modern standards, maybe 2% to 3%, and more like a fermented porridge than anything you'd recognize in a modern bar. But in a climate where Nile River water could carry dangerous pathogens, particularly parasites and bacteria, fermented beer with its natural antimicrobial properties was genuinely safer to drink. The fermentation process lowered the pH, and the ethanol killed many common waterborne organisms. Beer was, in a measurable and practical sense, public health infrastructure in ancient Egypt, and the Egyptians knew it. In around 1157 BCE, under Pharaoh Ramesses III, the government failed to deliver beer and grain rations to the tomb workers at Deir el-Medina. The workers responded by walking off the job. A scribe named Amenachte documented the entire thing on what's now called the Turin Strike Papyrus. It is the first recorded labor strike in human history, and it happened because the beer stopped showing up. People will endure a lot. They will not endure working in the desert heat without beer. The Egyptians attributed the invention of beer to Osiris, god of the dead, resurrection, and the eternal cycle. Not as punishment, not as temptation, as a gift. As one of the things that made civilized life possible, alongside bread and medicine, beer was a pillar of what it meant to be human. They brewed it. They drank it, they offered it to their gods, they buried it with their dead, and they paid for their grandest architectural achievements with it. And here, I want you to notice a thread, because it keeps appearing everywhere. Every culture, every continent, every time period. When we find the earliest evidence of intentional beer production, it is almost always tied to something sacred. The Natufians brewed in a burial cave. The Sumerians dedicated a goddess to it and wrote hymns. The Egyptians offered it to Osiris at Göbekli Tepe, the oldest monumental architecture in the world, the massive stone pillars and carved animal figures. Researchers found large stone troughs capable of holding up to 160 liters of liquid. Chemical traces of oxalate residue suggest fermented grain beverages. People may have been gathering from across the region, building these extraordinary structures, and drinking beer together in ceremonies. This is 12,000 years ago. Before farming, before cities, before permanent houses, beer was not invented as a way to relax after work. Beer was invented in the context of death, ritual, community, and the sacred. From the very beginning, the purpose of beer was to bring people together at the moments that mattered most. Now, let me take you forward through time, because the story doesn't stop in the ancient world. It keeps evolving, and every evolution connects directly back to the same grain plus water plus yeast reaction that a Natufian stumbled onto 13,000 years ago. Skip ahead to medieval Europe. Beer is everywhere. Monasteries across Germany, Belgium, and France have become the primary centers of brewing innovation. Benedictine and Trappist monks are brewing beer for several reasons. They need sustenance during fasting periods because liquid bread was considered acceptable when solid bread was not. They need income because selling beer funded the monastery. And they had something that almost nobody else in medieval Europe had: literacy, record-keeping, and a systematic approach to experimentation. Monks didn't just brew. They documented, refined, and improved. They were, in a very real sense, the first professional brewing scientists. And then one monk changed everything. Well, she wasn't a monk exactly, she was an abbess. Around 1150 CE, Hildegard of Bingen, a Benedictine nun and polymath who also composed music, wrote theological texts, and described the natural world in extraordinary detail, wrote what is considered the first recorded mention of using hops in beer. In her book Physica, written around 1150, she noted that hops added bitterness, improved flavor, and, critically, preserved the beer for longer periods. Before hops, beer spoiled quickly. Brewers used a mixture of herbs and spices called gruit, which worked inconsistently and tasted wildly different from batch to batch. Hops changed that. Hops contain alpha acids that act as a natural preservative and antibiotic, inhibiting the growth of bacteria that cause beer to go sour. A single plant transformed beer from something you had to drink within days of making it into something that could be stored, transported, and sold over long distances. Think about what that means for beer. For 12,000 years, beer was local. You brewed it, you drank it, and if you didn't drink it fast enough, it went bad. Hops turned beer into a commodity. Hops made the global beer industry possible. By 1516, in the city of Ingolstadt, the Bavarian dukes Wilhelm IV and Ludwig X issued the Reinheitsgebot, the German beer purity law, which stated that beer could only be made from 3 ingredients: water, barley, and hops. It is the oldest food quality regulation still in effect today, more than 500 years old. Yeast wasn't mentioned because nobody knew it existed yet. They knew that something made the liquid ferment, but they had no idea it was a living organism. They called the mysterious foamy stuff that appeared during brewing goddess good, or goddess air, because what else would you call an invisible force that turns grain water into something worth living for? That invisible force would remain a mystery for another 300 years. In 1857, a French chemist named Louis Pasteur published a paper called Mémoires sur la fermentation alcoolique that fundamentally changed the understanding of fermentation. Pasteur demonstrated that fermentation was not a purely chemical process, as most scientists believed at the time. It was a biological one. Living organisms, tiny single-celled fungi, were consuming sugar and producing alcohol and carbon dioxide. The yeast was alive, and it was doing the work. This was an earthquake in biology and in brewing simultaneously, because once you understood that a living organism was responsible for fermentation, you could start controlling it. You could select for specific yeast strains, you could manage temperature, you could predict outcomes, you could, for the first time in 13,000 years of brewing history, actually understand what was happening inside the vessel. And then in 1883, at the Carlsberg Laboratory in Copenhagen, a mycologist named Emil Christian Hansen isolated the first pure strain of lager yeast Saccharomyces pastorianus. Named after Pasteur, Hansen developed a method for growing a single yeast cell into a pure culture, eliminating the unpredictable wild yeasts that had made every batch of beer a gamble for millennia. Carlsberg, to their enormous credit, gave the yeast culture away for free to other breweries. They did not patent it. They shared it because they believed better beer was more important than competitive advantage. And that single decision, the free distribution of pure yeast culture, is why modern lager tastes consistent from batch to batch and brewery to brewery, anywhere in the world. Every lager you have ever drunk owes its consistency to a Danish laboratory and a decision to be generous. So here's the full arc. And I want you to feel the weight of it. 10 million years ago, a genetic mutation in a small primate on a forest floor made ethanol metabolism efficient. That mutation spread through the primate line and into every human being who has ever lived. It made us biologically inclined toward fermented things before we had any idea what fermentation was. 13,000 years ago, Natufian hunter-gatherers in a cave in Israel deliberately brewed beer from wild grain. They did it before agriculture existed. They did it in a burial cave for their dead. 12,000 years ago, people at Göbekli Tepe in Turkey were possibly building the world's first monumental structures, partly to have a place to brew and drink together. 9,000 years ago, people in China had complex fermented beverages with multiple ingredients and mold-based fermentation starters. 5,000 years ago, Sumerians ran their economy on beer, paid workers in beer, wrote hymns to a beer goddess, and encoded brewing recipes in poetry. 3,700 years ago, the Babylonians legislated beer quality and drowned people who watered it down. 3,000 years ago, Egyptian pyramid builders were drinking 5 liters a day and offering it to Osiris. 900 years ago, a German nun figured out that a single plant could preserve beer and accidentally created the modern brewing industry. 500 years ago, Bavarian law defined what beer could contain. 170 years ago, Pasteur proved that yeast was alive. 140 years ago, a Danish laboratory isolated pure yeast and gave it away for free. And tonight, you're going to open a beer. Maybe from a can, maybe from a bottle, maybe from a tap at a place you like. You're going to drink it without thinking about any of this, and that's fine. That's the point. You don't need to think about 10 million years of evolutionary biology to enjoy a cold beer on a Tuesday, but now you know that drink has a longer story than almost anything else in your life. Longer than the language you speak, longer than the clothes you wear, longer than the concept of money or writing or cities. The grain, the water, the yeast, the warmth. The same 4 elements doing the same quiet chemical work they've been doing since before your species had a name. Every beer is a 13,000-year-old recipe brewed by the descendants of people who figured it out in a cave. And behind that, 10 million years of ancestors reaching for something fermented because their bodies told them to. We didn't invent beer. We discovered it. And then we spent the rest of human history trying to make it better.